Okay. Well, as you know, it's Mother's Day, and I thought I would talk about the importance of mothers. And you know, if you stop and think about it, mothers have been very important in the plan of God in the Bible. Mothers have played a key and vital role in the purposes and plan of God as it's revealed to us throughout the Bible, and not just to point out that that there are mothers, but there are mothers that are singled out for their special. Well, I'll tell you what it is that they're singled out for: their faith. Just like Hebrews 11 gives us a list of the great heroes of the Old Testament, male and female. And what it points out in Hebrews chapter 11 is that what made them special, what set them apart, was not necessarily what they did, but what they believed. Their faith. And that's the whole point of Hebrews chapter 11. And I'd like to begin reading today, and I just thought I'd read a few of these and look at what we can apply to in our lives, what we can use as an example. And I thought I would talk first of all about the mother of Moses in Exodus chapter 1, actually chapter 2. If you read in Exodus chapter 1, it talks about how there came along a Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph, and he felt threatened by the growth of the Hebrew children, and the Hebrews were growing, and so he ordered that the midwives should take all the male children and kill them, and they didn't do it. The midwives defied Pharaoh. By the way, in the history of the translation of the Bible into English, of course into other languages, it's a historical fact that some kings of England, like King James, for whom the King James translation is named, he especially did not like chapter 1 of Exodus because it talks about people defying the king. He didn't like that very much. So there were chapters that he didn't like, but this is one of those. And you know what? We're Christians are naturally sort of agreeable, submissive people, but when the human rulers require wrong things, it's right to defy the human rulers. And that's what the midwives did. Pharaoh demanded that they should kill the male children, and they didn't do it. They disobeyed the king, and they were right because they obeyed their conscience, and they did the right thing. So the Pharaoh in chapter 1 says, he called the midwives, what do you think you're doing? I told you to kill the male children. And they came up with an excuse. They said, well, these Hebrew women, they're so lively, and they give birth before we can get there. That's kind of their excuse. So he said, well, the next thing he said is, well, if there's any male children born, just throw them in the river. Just throw them in the water and save the females alive, because he felt threatened by the expansion of the Hebrews in the nation of Egypt. Okay, in chapter 2, we read this. There was a man of the house of Levi, and took a wife of a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. Now right away we know this is a problem because of chapter 1, all the Pharaoh's decrees, so she's got a little difficulty here when the son is born. When she saw that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took him in an ark, and took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein. And she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. The flags mean the reeds, is what that's talking about. And his sister stood afar off, to wit. When you read the words to wit in the King James language Bible, wit means to know what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself in the river. And her maidens walked along the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she'd opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said, go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. That was a happy circumstance there. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away, and nurse it for me, and I will give thee wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it, and the child grew. And she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses. And she said, because I drew him out of the water. Now, as we know from our knowledge of the rest of the story, we know Moses is very important in the plan of God. But think about this from the point of view of his mother. Now, I bring this up because she appears in Hebrews chapter 11. It says, by faith. When he was born, he was hidden and put in this little circumstance. We're told in Hebrews chapter 11 that this was all done by faith. But you think about how she must have felt as a mother, having to turn him over to Pharaoh in the household of Pharaoh. And it says that she did that. She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. Of course, this is better than being thrown in the river and killed. It preserved his life. I'm sure that's the way she reasoned it. But think about what this must feel like from a mother's point of view. It's your child, and you turn it over to, you might say, well, at least if it's not the enemy, somebody you might have some doubts about whether he would be raised the way you might want to would prefer that he be raised. In a sense, it's like saying, here, I'm turning you over to the world in a way, because Egypt is sometimes considered a type of the world. But we're told in Hebrews chapter 11, she did this by faith. Faith in what? Faith in God. What did she believe? What did she have? Think about this. What did she have to have faith in or believe as a mother in this circumstance? She had to believe that though she was, in one sense, giving Moses over to the household of Pharaoh to be raised, that God's influence on him would be greater or stronger, or ultimately win and overcome. And I think that's something we can all identify with, it, whether we're mothers or fathers or whatever. At a certain point, we can't oversee our children all their lives. At a certain point, we have, just like Moses' mother, have to let them go into the world. That we can believe like she did, by faith, that God's influence will be there. And just as we quoted this morning when we were singing the songs, he said, I'll never leave you or forsake you. And that's not just true for us, but for her as well. But I think that's interesting that she did this by faith. We just read the story sometimes and don't really take into account necessarily how that must have felt like. I'm sure it was a challenge to her faith. But she acted on her faith, and she kept her faith strong. And you know that God did what he did, and he was faithful to Moses. And Moses did, at the right time, awaken to the voice of God, and was a great hero in the stories of the Scripture, and fulfilled and advanced God's plan in his generation. There's another one I'd like to read about, and that's Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Now, in this case, in Exodus, we're given one mother, a single mother. But many times, the mothers that appear in the Scripture, and we're looking at them as examples, they appear in pairs. And it's interesting to see, as an example, Abraham and Sarah. And instead of reading it from Genesis, I'd like to read it to you from Galatians. And by doing that, we get Paul's application of the story. It's Galatians chapter 4 and beginning in verse 22. Because Paul uses it for an example to teach something else, but what he says is interesting. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 22. Again, Abraham's wife Sarah, we're told, she appears in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, by faith. We'll see that in just a second. Galatians chapter 4. And Paul says here in verse 22, for it is written, Abraham had two sons, the one by the bondmaid, the other by the free woman. And we know from the story that the bondmaid was Hagar, and the wife was Sarah. And we're presented this story of Abraham and his offspring and these mothers by presenting them in pairs. Verse 23, that he who was born of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was born by promise. He who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman, that's Sarah, by promise. Well, what does Paul mean when he says one was born after the flesh and one was by promise? Well, if you read the story of Abraham and Sarah, they were advanced in years, and we're told pretty plainly in the Scripture that Sarah was beyond child birth, the proper time for childbirth. And not only that, she was barren. She was unable to conceive and bring forth children after the flesh. What he means by after the flesh was the fact that they had a younger woman, a handmaiden, and Sarah had the bright idea to Abraham and said, why don't you go into my handmaiden, and since I can't conceive, let the handmaiden conceive, because she's young and probably fertile, and you can have an offspring that way, because God had come to Abraham. And consider this, that before this happened, God had come to Abraham and made him a promise. And he said, your offspring, Abraham, your seed, will be as the stars of heaven. Paul tells us, and he quotes this, in fact, here we're in chapter 4. Look at what Paul says about the